Post-processing is used to apply effects to a 3D scene, such as blur, color correction, and bloom. Used correctly, it can help your project look outstanding. In this lesson, we will go from this 3D scene with just a simple lighting and a nice 3D models into this. You can see the grain, the autofocus of element where I put my mouse, so I can focus either one character or the other or any item on the scene. And the beautiful bloom effect you can see on the candles. To use post-processing effects with React 3 Fiber, we will be using React Post-Processing Library. It's a wrapper for the original post-processing library. The documentation is very useful. You have the default effect composer where you will put your effects into, and you have all the effects available with the different props they take and how it works. Let's add the library into our project. Yarn add React 3 post-processing, then yarn dev, and we can hide the terminal. To keep our code organized, we will create a new component. We'll name it effects.jsx. Inside, we create our effects component, and inside, we put our effect composer from React 3 post-processing. Now let's go to our app, and at the end of the canvas, add our effects. Be careful that it is the one we created and not the one from Dry. If we look at our scene now, it looks like all objects have a mesh normal material. It's because our effects composer will run a normal path, so we can disable it. And because we had no effects, we could only see it. Now our scene is looking what it looked before. We can add some effects. Let's add our first effect. We'll be using vignette. If you're familiar to photography, you already know what it does. It is darkening or brightening the corners of an image. Okay, we can see it a little bit, but it's very subtle. Let's increase it. To adjust the parameters, we will be using use control. So vignette config is equal to use controls from Leva. We will display it in a separate folder named vignette, and all our parameters are here. We'll add enabled to true. Then for the other effects, we can go into the documentation, find vignette. You can see there is offset and darkness. We'll set offset. We'll be using a value of 0.1, a minimum of 0, and a maximum of 1. Then we will add darkness, a value of 0.92, so it's very dark, and same, minimum 0 and maximum. We will do that if vignette config is enabled, only we will render our effect and it will be applied. We can add and remove them that way. So to add our config, we need to destructure the vignette config, and the max here is 1, not 0. Now if we reload our scene, we can see it's way darker on the edges and corner. It's drawing the attention to the center of the scene. You can adjust the parameter to make it very central or more subtle. Now let's add a second effect, the bloom. So it's the glow we see around the candles before, the light sources. For each effect, we'll do almost the same. So we can copy it. It will be bloom config. Use control, and we group them in a folder named bloom. We'll have the enable, so we can have the same logic for every effect. But the effects we have here are different. We can find them in the documentation. We have luminance threshold. It's based on the color value of a material. When it will reach that threshold, it will start blooming. So we set it to 1. We can keep the minimum to 0 and set the maximum to 2. And for the intensity, it's how bloomy it will look like. We can set the intensity to 1.28, and also we set the minimum to 0 and maximum to 2. And the last one that will affect our bloom is the mipmap blur. We'll set it to true. Now let's duplicate that effect. We'll be using the bloom config and render the bloom component using the bloom config. But if we have a look, nothing is happening. This is because our luminance threshold is at 1 and we don't have any color that is more than 1. So let's update our candle material. We'll go to the tavern. We'll be using a use effect to change the material that is responsible of the candles. To find the one responsible of it, you can either open the model in Blender or just enable, disable some of them or change their color to identify which one is the correct one. But now I know it's materials.mat12. To increase the intensity of our color, we'll be using the multiply scalar method. We set the value to 50. What it will do, it will take all channel, red, green, and blue, and increase them proportionally. So you don't have to bother about what color it was. It will just increase it. If we look at our candles right now, we don't have bloom yet, and they look white. This is because tone mapping is enabled on the material, and it will clamp the value to 1. So we have all channels to 1, and it will look white. We just have to edit our materials to tone mapped is equal to false. Now you can see that our candles are blooming nicely. You can play with mip-map blur to see what is the impact of this prop. Now let's see how we can adjust the brightness and contrast of our scene to have more control of the overall looking. As we did for the other effects, we copy-paste, we create brightness, contrast, config, we name it brightness, contrast, enabled to true, we keep that logic, and we just have brightness and contrast. The minimum is -1 to 1, and same here. Let's set them to 0 and add it. So brightness, contrast, config, brightness, contrast from React 3 post-processing, and brightness, contrast, config. Now we can play with the slider and find the value that fits what we like to do. Once you have found the value, you set them as the default value, 0.02 and -0.1. Of course, use your preferred values here. Another effect for color correction is the sepia effect. So we will have enabled sepia config, sepia, so enabled. Then we have what is called a blend function. The value we'll use for the moment darken. And as it is a string, we will need to do a drop down. We'll be using options. And the array of value it will be is object.keys of blend function. But the auto import is not working, so copy paste it. Import blend function from post-processing. So it will take all the different blend function and put them in that array of options. And we don't need contrast and mip-map blur for the sepia config. So is sepia config enabled? And we render the sepia component with our sepia config. Then, because blend function is a bit special, we need to define what blend function it uses. So it's a blend function of the strings we are using here. So it's sepia config dot blend function, because it's expecting the blend function and not the string naming the blend function. Now you can play with the blend function choice to have different results and the render of the color. I will keep the darken as it's making the wood less orange than without it. I prefer that overall look. Another effect that Photograph will already know is the noise. So noise config, we'll name it in a noise folder, enabled, and the parameter is opacity. Let's set the value just a little bit to 0.1, the minimum to 0, and the maximum to 1. Then if we have noise config enabled, we will render our noise with the noise config. It's very subtle, so let's increase it, and you can see all those grains. It's like taking photo in low light with a high ISO. You can see the difference with and without. It's a bit brightening the scene and add a retro touch, so I quite like that effect. We are almost good with the effect. Let's add a final one. We'll be using the autofocus one. Const autofocus is equal to use control of autofocus. Enable true. We will use mouse true. So it will be based on our mouse cursor position to define where is the focus. And let's add the different parameter, the focus range, the bokeh scale, the focal length, and the smooth time when it changed the focus. Now let's add it to our effect composer. It's a lot of effects actually. Autofocus dot enabled and autofocus with the config. Oh, I forgot config here. Yes. And also here. Now we can see almost everything is blurry until we put our mouse cursor in that position and it smoothly changes the focus. So now it's on the bottom left. We can put it on that bottle, but we can put it on the character in the background. So it emphasizes position what character we are focusing on. Of course, don't overuse effect and keep them subtle. And it can also affect performance if you put too many of them. We didn't cover all post-processing effects, so have a look at the documentation and all the available ones. You can have example for each of them. Finally, if you are looking for some inspiration, you can go to React 3 Fiber documentation in the examples section. Then search for effects, and each example has different tags. So you can see here it's effects, it's applying bloom, depth of field, and reflections. So have a look at them. It's very nice and simple examples.